passion has to be balanced with practicality. So this thing about chase your passion at all costs, and you will be Steve Jobs and all of that. It will happen to one Steve Jobs, but it won't happen to 9,999 other people. So I think that balance between passion and practicality is important, and we shouldn't understate or underestimate it.
I think people underestimate the time these kinds of things take. So if you're going in with a hard stop of 6 months, etc., I think you better not do it rather than wasting those 6 months. Also, it's not happening. Most of these things take much longer. You should be prepared for years of this. If you're not willing to do that, if it happens earlier, great. But if you're not, if you in your mind are saying that I want to give this a shot for 6 months, let's see how it works. If not, I want to shut it. Then it's best not to do it in most cases. I think it will not rarely ever actually happens that soon.
Hi, welcome to the very first episode of our podcast series. I'm Suman Ghose, and with me is Atul Nath. We are your hosts for this podcast. While our work journeys till now have been quite different, looking ahead, our paths could be more aligned due to similarities in what we seek. Purpose, passion, and happiness would be more important. As we spoke to more people about this, it became amply clear that this topic resonates with most of them. In this podcast series, we learn from people who have made a successful transition to their second innings.
For the very first episode, we decided to have two guests with us. The first is Sameer Nair. Sameer graduated from IIM Bangalore in 1996. Early on, he worked in the financial sector and thereafter in investment banking and transaction advisory. In 2008, he founded Gram Oorja, which provides sustainable energy solutions in remote regions of India. It has done impressive work across thousands of villages, more than 700 community-level projects. The second guest is Sachin Rudra. Sachin focuses on helping businesses, especially startups, in consumer-facing industries and tech-enabled solutions, and especially those that have major social impact. Prior to this, he has worked across FMCG, consulting, pharma, private equity, and venture capital across multiple geographies in Unilever, McKinsey, and many other illustrious companies. We had a very fascinating conversation with both of them. Come, let's listen in.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We have with us today Sachin Rudra and Sameer Nair. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Very excited to do this. So let's get right into the show. Atul, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Suman. I'm very excited to have this discussion with Sameer and Sachin. Thank you very much again. I'm going to just kick it off by requesting Sameer to talk about himself a little bit and tell us his backstory, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so like all of us, I grew up in the 70s in Bombay. I was born and brought up in Bombay. My parents hail from Kerala, so they are first generation Mumbaikars in that sense. I grew up, I've spent barring the 2 years at IIM Bangalore, I've spent all my life in Bombay, even post and before that. I went to one of the pretty well-known schools in Bombay, did my graduation in math and stats, and then I decided to do my MBA. And 94, joined the IIM Bangalore batch. But now have worked 16 years in Gram Oorja, but before that I spent most of my time in the financial sector in one role or the other.
Sure. Sameer, I'm just gonna delve a little bit deeper. You mentioned that you grew up in Mumbai, so in that sense, Kerala is just about your roots. I assume that you didn't really grow up in Kerala, but did you kind of happen to visit with family there when you were growing up and stuff like that? And what were those visits like? Because for all of us I think all of us pretty much grew up in big cities, at most maybe a little bit of experience in tier 2, but going to Kerala and those visits home to ancestral homes or whatever, what was that like?
Right. So one of the things, especially in my school, I must have been the only person whose parents were first generation Mumbaikars, in the sense or at least first generation urban families. Both my father and mother were born and brought up in Kerala, and so therefore we had a lot of connect. So through my childhood, right till I was in school, pretty much every year, we used to take the train in the summers and go there and spend a couple of months. That was the scene. In those days, there weren't even that many flights actually. So, and very often it kind of connects in some ways to my what I'm doing now, in the sense that I have spent some time in villages in India, right? I mean, those 1 month a year for, let's say, 8 or 10 years that I remember, right? But obviously, that is not very reflective or not representative of rural India, actually. Although I grew up, I mean, in the sense when I visited a place called Palakkad, which is not very close to any large city in Kerala. But rural Kerala is a little different from most of rural India. So my dad, so speaking of Gram Oorja, which is essentially we were trying to electrify villages. We started in 2008 and continue doing so. Even now we do that. Villages without electricity even now. And I keep asking this question to my parents as to when did they get electricity in their homes, because they, like I said, they grew up in places which would be considered rural back then. Even now, I mean, the quasi. So 1956, 57 is when they got electricity. So 58. And we are sitting in, today and like I said, this is roughly about 120 kilometers from Cochin and 100 odd kilometers from Kozhikode. It's not like very close to a city or anything. So my experience didn't kind of give me, or rather, what I experienced as a child didn't give me too much of a heads up on what rural India really meant. I mean, we had this, it was fashionable a few years back to talk about India versus Bharat. And I think that is actually a huge oversimplification itself. Bharat itself is probably at least 5 or 6 different shades, depending on which part of the country you're in, and within those parts, which kind of localities, what is the community which communities do people belong to? I mean, all of these are not things when we grew up we even cared about much, right? As in school, we didn't care about it because there wasn't any big difference in, let's say, the backgrounds of all the other students with me. But these things started getting quite interesting, yeah. So there is some idea of Kerala. Like I said, it was a train journey. It used to take 36 hours from Bombay, and that specific train still runs. There was no Konkan railway back then. Konkan finally became operational in 96 or 97. So we had to go from here all the way up to Madras almost, just a little. So the train went from here to a place called Arkonam, which is a little away from Madras, and then you come back to Kerala. So it is a very crazy journey.
Yeah. One doesn't realize, I suppose, how much has changed when the moment. But I'm just going to pause you there, Sameer. Damn good. Let's jump into listening to Sachin and his story. Sachin, over to you, please. Tell us more about yourself.
Yeah. So I'm Sachin, and I currently live in Bangalore. And I think to start off, I come from a sort of mixed background in the sense that my mother is from UP, my father is from Bengal. But I think in my growing up years, the most defining sort of categorization for me was the fact that my father was in the Indian Army. And that, I think, unless you have a lot of family wealth, which we didn't, kind of makes you well and truly middle class. But it also cocoons you and gives you a whole bunch of privileges because you're living in those cantonments, you are going into those, good schools. Like I learned how to horse ride and I learned how to ski and all sorts of things just because my dad was in the army. And I think my first real exposure to the diversity of India, was when I came to St. Stephen's College, which is where I did my undergraduate degree. And suddenly I was like, oh my God, there are people coming all the way from Bihar to study for this exam called UPSC, which I hadn't really heard of before. I knew what the IAS was, but I didn't know that there was a very, very important and big exam called the UPSC, which you had to clear. So that's when I think I got a sense of the diversity of India. There were people who were looking to just go abroad. There were people who were looking to take the CAT. And of course, there were people who were looking to sort of sit the UPSC. So that's where I got, my diversity quotient going about India. Truth be told, before that, in the public school that I went to, we used to only listen to sort of English music. And I was introduced to the world of Kishore Kumar and Mohammad Rafi and Lata Mangeshkar by my roommate at St. Stephen's in my first year, who, as it so happened, had just done 2-3 years of education in Washington, D.C., because his father was a diplomat. So here was this guy who had grown up all his life in India, who was listening at that point in time to Madonna and Michael Jackson. And here was a guy who was coming to St. Stephen's College from Washington, D.C., who was really into Kishore Kumar and Mohammad Rafi. So, that I think is what, also what undergraduate education brings to people rather than just the degree that you did. And then I think looking forward, two sort of things stand out in my mind as weird stories. So one is what I now like to call the curse of the overachiever. Okay. So, and it's a little bit, like you get onto the treadmill. You're in St. Stephen's, everybody's taking the CAT, so you take the CAT, and then you get into an MBA institute, and then everybody's applying for consulting, so you apply for consulting, and you get into McKinsey or Citibank or something, and you're almost sometimes, I think, at that point in time in India and in my life, maybe because security was such a big issue, and also because there were so many opportunities staring you in the face. Frankly, I think I just took step after step after step without really thinking about it, without really internalizing whether it's something that I wanted to do, whether it's something that I was suited to do, but I was just doing it because I got through the CAT and I, got into X, Y, or Z company, and I just kept doing that. And that's truly one of the reasons why I ended up doing an MBA and frankly joining the corporate sector. It wasn't sort of this urge to work in the corporate sector for a long period of time. And I must say I enjoyed it a lot, and I think it's been a wonderful journey. But I think reaching there wasn't I don't really think it was a conscious path which I had set out for myself, but it was really the curse of the achiever, of just getting into the right institutes, getting the right scholarships, getting the right jobs, and then just doing it because you were getting it, and there was no reason not to do it. And then I think another seminal part of where when I moved sort of 20 years into my career into a slightly different path came. My first company out of business school was Hindustan Lever, which is now Hindustan Unilever. And we had at that point in time, you could either choose your profit center or you could choose the state you wanted to be the sales manager of. So I chose the hot profit center, which was personal products at that point in time. And I got posted as sales manager to Bihar. And everybody was like, oh my God. Like my parents were like, what is going to happen to this boy? And there were those stories about young sales managers getting kidnapped and married to people as they went about their work.
And this is some years ago. This is not
this is
Bihar
25
today.
years ago.
This is Bihar in the 90s.
In the heydays of this thing. There were, Atul, I don't know, I mean, this is not an apocryphal story, but there were towns, a town called Bihar Sharif, for example, which when I went to do my visit, like as an area sales manager, the distributor would send a Jeep and two of the guys on the Jeep would have live guns because there would be a real risk that something would go wrong and somebody would think that kidnapping this guy is a good idea because some multinational company in London will pay a ransom to get him released. So he used to send actually two guys with live guns and live bullets. I don't know legal or illegal. I have no idea. But yeah, it was that kind of Bihar. And I was like, oh my God, I was in Calcutta branch and I was in Bihar And I used to go there and be like, this is the slowest and the most backward, and my career is ruined. But one of the things that struck me was that every person who I met, whether it was a Hindustan Lever salesperson or it was the distributor sales guys, who would go on their bikes around the towns and take orders for Pepsodent toothpaste and Sunsilk and Fair and Lovely and all at that point in time. Everybody wanted the same thing that you and I want, and the guy in Bombay who Sameer was talking about wants, and what the guy in Kerala wants. He wanted to build a house. He wanted his children to go to the right schools. He obviously wanted enough food on the table. He wanted to buy a car and just get ahead. So, what I think I realize maybe Bihar has got locked into is not that the people are lazy. It's not that they don't want to work hard. It's not that they don't have ambition, but it's just the opportunity. And I think Sameer was contrasting it really well with what Mumbai provided as an opportunity to people who live there. And I was seeing the other end of the spectrum where people were being held back. They didn't have enough money to take their mothers to a private hospital when she had a heart attack. But they were being held back not because of their own ambition or their own lack of work ethic and all those good things we hear about, but just opportunity. And 20 years later, I also realized that, the money I had made, the position I had reached had to do, I hope, with some amount of, aptitude, but a lot of it, and I would argue most of it, had to do with opportunity. And my journey was about how can we, or I, who've gained from the opportunity that I've been offered because of my demographic and because of, truthfully, what happened to India in the 1990s and the early 2000s. How can that opportunity affect other people? Because I think the trickle down, that famous economics, sort of trickle down, was not working and was definitely not working fast enough. So India is one of the few economies whose distribution of income has actually worsened over the last 20 years, which means we've become more unequal. And I was just like, is it only that top 1% or 5% or 10%, which is getting the fruits of India's liberalization and growth and, all the opportunities that people today have in New York and London and Madrid and Tokyo? And is there a whole swath of India, Bharat, whatever you want to call it, which is just getting left behind? So it was that kernel which I carried over the rest of my purely corporate career. And I went into consulting, I went into private equity, but I carried that kernel of thought with me through those 20 years, which finally culminated in me trying to see whether I could do a little bit more about it than just carrying it at the back of my head and thinking about it every few years.
I'm saying it's really nice that we started with this longish introduction. We also got a glimpse of how our economies have transformed. Somebody talked of from grazing cows to doing KPMG. But while I was hearing that, I'm thinking maybe the guy in KPMG now wants to retire and do agriculture and maybe graze some cows. So life can come full circle, right? And we will talk about taking the plunge, right? So yeah, thanks. I think that was lovely. Sachin, anything else you want to add in terms of background? Otherwise, we'll dive right into the topic, right? Okay. Atul, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to talk about real quick was, since we've got a very good, run up in terms of where each of their uh, background and education, etc., is that and I'll start with Sachin, since your story is fresh in our minds, that when was it that you kind of decided to venture out on your own in the space that you're in now, and how long did it kind of take you to decide to do this? And you've given us a very good window into the why of it, but a little bit about the how and the what you wanted to do at that point.
So Atul, I mean, one point I wanted to make, for me, I think, taking the plunge was maybe a little bit easier because I didn't have to find what I wanted to do. I had this kernel, I had this thought. I felt that because of various things, I was handed a set of opportunities which I benefited from, and providing some of those opportunities to other people who maybe didn't have the same access to St. Stephen's College or an Indian Institute of Management or a McKinsey or whatever was something that I wanted to do. And I think that was very important, because I've often heard of people talk about finding a passion. I have to find a passion. It's like you're an archaeologist and the passion is buried somewhere and you're going to find it if you remove these 24 rocks. But for me, I think I knew what my passion was. And absolutely to the point that you were making, I kind of had to develop it, and also see what to do, how to go about doing it. So maybe we can get to the how to go about doing it a little bit later, and I can talk through my journey over there. But my development was two or threefold. So in the last decade, I saw 3 or 4 trends happening. Okay, I found that money was very important. So, and I was in private equity and venture capital at that point in time. And I did think that finances could unlock opportunities for a whole variety of people. The second thing which I found, which I thought was truly transformative for me, was how entrepreneurship was carrying on in India. When I was passing out of St. Stephen's College, people used to literally look down upon business. And they used to be, I hate to use a pejorative term, but they used to say, "Are ye to lala company hai." Like doing business was like a bad thing, and everybody wanted to be, in the IAS or government service or whatever. And in the 20 years after that, I found that the whole thing had turned, and maybe it was Steve Jobs, and maybe it was Infosys, and maybe it was whoever, but it was wonderful to see that entrepreneurship had, really taken hold. People passing out of the IIMs were looking to become entrepreneurs and not just work for a Citibank or a McKinsey or a Morgan Stanley. And I had, because of venture capital, exposure to both of those areas. I knew that finance was an important part of the solution, and I knew entrepreneurship was an important part of the solution. And what I set my mind to do was to bring together or bring finance to entrepreneurs who were bringing opportunity to people at the bottom of the pyramid. So I was like, okay, here is the idea, and here is a fleshing out of what you need to get done, or what you need to put your shoulder to the wheel on. And if you're able to do this successfully, it would reach it. The last thing, Atul and Suman and Sameer, worth mentioning is I also realized that I was not going to solve India's poverty problem all on my own. Okay, so I was like, I'm not going to. It's not going to happen. But I was like, if you can contribute to it, and if you can create a few examples other people can replicate, you've left enough on this earth or in India, for people to work on and carry forward. Because it's not like 400 million people are going to be. There's the government, there are not-for-profits, there's the World Bank. Everybody has to do their work. But I was like, if you can move the needle for a few people, and if you can create examples other people can replicate and copy, you're kind of done.
Super.
So that was the business or strategy plan, as it
were. Right. That was the thought process that brought you where you are. Yeah. Sameer, just to reiterate, how long did it kind of take you to decide to venture into Gram Oorja? Of course, there is your first story before that, and we will get into that a little bit. But I mean, considering what you're doing right now, how long did it take you to decide? And
right. So we incorporated this company on 24th April 2008. But I think the idea, my co-founder Anshuman and I, we started talking about this in mid 2007 or so, I think. So so we were working together, in a boutique investment bank. We were raising private equity and doing some M&A and all that. So that 2-3 years we had spent together. Anshuman and I, we were also hostel mates. He was also in the same hostel. So that's how I kind of knew him quite well. So we had this idea since about 8 mid to a little earlier, 2007. So about a year-ish is when it kind of from the germ of the idea to actual incorporation of the company was probably a year-ish, I'd say.
And Atul, if I can just jump in there, Sameer, as you were doing this, was there a process of sort of delinking yourself from the private equity investment banking world, or was it like you just decided put in my
No,
papers, like here we go?
no. So till 2000, so the two of us, like I said, we were working together with Globus Capital Advisors. Anshuman kind of left a little earlier, saying that I want to start this. He knew that I was also going to come on board, but the idea was still a little, at that point of time, a little sketchy. So I said that, look, it's probably not wise for both of us to jump ship right now. So that's how we kind of managed it. So uh, we incorporated in 2008. I was a director. I, of course, informed it's a small 3 or 4 member team. So he knew about it, but I formally came on board in terms of full-time work in early 2009 in Gram Oorja. So I continued working with Globus, but Anshuman, like, since we actually did everything together, therefore, there was one person who was actually, kind of, who had quit a little earlier to spend more time on putting things together, right? Uh, in terms of identifying potential investors, thinking about what could be the plan, and so on and so forth.
And
Yeah.
But emotionally,
Yeah.
you had actually kind of
Midway,
committed that you were going to do it. I was just the
quite
physical
sure.
thing was a bit of a lag. That's all.
So the thing was, it was also contingent on it being able to raise some capital, right? So there was that.
Right.
So there was
Sure.
that issue there. So yes, emotionally you are, but you don't want to chuck it all away
Yeah.
at that moment. So there was that it was contingent on us being able to raise capital, and I think that, like I mentioned earlier, it was a good time to raise money. The GFC had not yet happened. If he had started in 2008, mid 2008, probably Gram Oorja may not have happened. It's like a series of accidents sometimes. It was a very good time. Everybody was on a high at that time, culminating in the Reliance Power issue in Jan 2008. That was kind of the first marker of how crazy things had become. Right? But everybody, especially in the sector, all our acquaintances, friends, and all are part of this whole ecosystem. Right? Everybody is so gung-ho about everything.
So that way, timing is a very important factor as well. I mean, timing, and I mean, I don't want to call it luck necessarily, but timing, luck, the right things aligning has a lot of play. Yeah.
Things beyond your control, I think. For
And I
some,
like
whatever personal reason, you might have spent another year ideating, and then the finding money might not have come so soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting, you mentioned that series of accidents. I mean, I get reminded of that quote which you just said, right, of Steve Jobs, that you can't connect the dots looking forward. I think there's a great example of that, isn't it? And okay, so let's good segue into emotions. So let's talk a little bit about emotions. A lot of these things is about taking the plunge. It's in a cold state, very easy to talk about rationally. What was the process? But when you have to do it, it's what I call the hot state. It's messy, it's emotional. Life gets in the way. When you really have to take the plunge and do something different, isn't it? So maybe I'll come to you, Sachin, first. So tell us a little bit about that part of where you actually decided to come out of a corporate job and get into something on your own. How was it like?
It was. I think, like you were mentioning, Shimon, it is definitely, stepping out, and it has all that messiness and heat associated with it. But I wanted to recount one story from the past, which might help you understand why it wasn't maybe as hot and messy for me. When I left Hindustan Lever in about 2001. And at that point in time, I was recruited to go and work in Boston for a company called Mitchell Madison Group. It was a consulting firm based out of the US. And the night I was leaving Calcutta, I had left Levers by then. I was leaving Calcutta to go home to visit my parents in Lucknow before leaving for Boston. I got a phone call from a very close friend of mine who used to work for the Mitchell Madison Group. saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't come to Boston because it's filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the US. So I'm on the Punjab Mail, which runs from Calcutta to Amritsar via Lucknow. And my basic thought through those, like just under 24 hours, is what am I going to tell my parents? Okay. And I still have, I used to write a diary at that point in time, and I still have that diary with me because my parents had told all their friends, oh, our son used to work for Hindustan Lever and now he's going to the US and to Boston and he's going to work for this cool like consulting firm. And I was like, what am I going to tell them? How am I going to break this to them? What is their reaction going to be? And I land up at Lucknow. My dad comes and picks me up from the railway station, and then we go home. And, after a cup of tea or whatever, I tell them, I said, hey, there's bad news. This company has filed for Chapter 11. It doesn't make sense for me to go to Boston. So then they were like, do you have a job? So I was like, no, because I've resigned from Hindustan Lever and this company are not going to, so there is no job. So they were like, okay. And the one thing which was amazing was the resilience they showed. And they were like, okay, so, remember, you still are from an IIM, you still went to St. Stephen's College, you've got great experience under your belt, you've got lots of friends, you can stay at home for the next 2 years and look for a job. It won't make any difference to the quality of our lives. So don't worry about it. Just start thinking about what's next. So, the reason I recount this story is because one of the things that I learned is it is like a cold shower. It knocks the breath out of you when it happens. And maybe that's why it's called the plunge. It just knocks the breath out of you, when it happens. And I tell a lot of people the first thing that affected me was not getting the salary credited to my account on the 31st or 30th of the month end. Because one was just so used to seeing that ping on your mobile phone, and then you had either the EMIs or the SIPs or this, that, and the other. And when it doesn't come, you're fine. You've done the spreadsheet. Everything is all right. But suddenly you get a little bit of a knot in your stomach about, how is this going to affect me? But because of my experience with MMG all those years back, I think I had more grit, I had more resilience, I had more ho jayega, if nothing works out, it will still be okay. Even today, though, when somebody asked me to introduce myself, when I used to tell people I work in private equity, their eyes would light up. When I tell them I'm working with startups to bring them funding so that they can build opportunities for below the poverty line, people's eyes light up, but not as much. Or for not as many people. Somebody are like, why are you doing this? So I think those are the sorts of emotions, a little bit of self-doubt, a little bit of, have I done this too early? Sometimes, am I a complete idiot? What were you thinking? You could have made that ESOP for $5 million and given 4 million of it away to startups, and that would have been more productive than the shit you're doing at the moment. Sometimes, oh my God, attracting talent to the social sector is so difficult, and I'm so used to working with people from IIMs or whatever. So I think those are the tough parts. They come from time to time, and they still come. Even though I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years, it's not like it's completely gone away. But like I said, I had one experience of being without a job, and this was, mind you, in 2001, which I think maybe in a way prepared me a little better for some of the emotional sort of upheavals, or what you're calling hot and messy stuff that you do.
Excellent. Yeah, I suppose, in terms of getting out of the comfort zone, when you're in a job, there is a certain amount of comfort. The moment you come out, you're suddenly out of the comfort zone. You don't have that paycheck coming in. And it's not that you get into cruise control after a while. People who are doing things on their own, probably it's ever changing, isn't it? So it's very difficult to get into a cruise control mode after that. But it's just that you get used to being out of your comfort zone. And probably that's what develops you as a person, isn't it? Because the resilience grows. Yeah, great. Samir, how about you? I know you were very satisfied. You had a house in Bombay. That's how you could do it. But was there some emotional angle to this as well?
I think by temperament, I think I was kind of not phased by not having a paycheck coming. I mean, it's just my makeup, I think. Like, people
Okay.
keep asking me this, but partly facilitated by what you just mentioned. I mean, obviously, if you don't have a home or, uh, you are obviously not going to be, the temperament won't help you, right? I mean, that's not going to help you. So
Can you give
sometimes,
our viewers some tips of how to build that kind of
no,
temperament?
I don't know. I mean, again, I don't know. It's just that there was this confidence in at least in the early part of my post graduating from IIM Bangalore that look, even if I try something for some time and I go back and you know interview with people, I'm reasonably confident that I'm going to add value to companies, and therefore maybe there might be some kind of a pay cut I have to take, etc. But I'm not really going to be out of a job for very long. Was the confidence I had in that part of my in the in first 5 6 years after I wasn't very concerned about what will happen. I was quite sure that कुछ ना कुछ हो जाएगा, maybe.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
perhaps the fact that I I was okay with not being in a job which had this brand value. Let's say like, okay, I quit Bank of America, I'm fine. If I have to go back to some other bank which doesn't have the same brand at that time, it's fine. It's still a job. So somewhere, I think there were two things. I think one is that there was some comfort because of the home situation, etc., and the other was there was some confidence, and I think that confidence is okay in that part of your life. You can get back, but as you get older, I think that is misplaced confidence. I don't think you can do that as easily when you're in your mid 40s, etc. I mean, that's a realization that I've had now. Thankfully, I've not had to kind of try again, but it's probably when you're that young, you feel like ho jayega kuch na kuch. I'm quite sure I'll be able to manage getting back into with maybe some compromise, what would be considered socially a compromise in terms of the brand, etc. Otherwise, I was pretty confident kuch na kuch ho jayega, which is, I think, one reason was why I was able to do this. Most people, I'm sure, if you really ask them to think about it, I mean, a person 4 years out of IIM Bangalore, do you think you can afford 6 months out and then come back? And do you think you'll find a job? Most people would rationally say yes, they feel, but they perhaps will not be able to deal with the actual situation. Perhaps, I mean, it's
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
thing to compute it and say, yeah, hona
Yep,
chahiye, why are we so worried?
absolutely.
But
Yeah,
to actually
yeah.
do it might be a little difficult. I think that's
Which
the
is
problem.
exactly what Shuman is talking about, that cold state and the hot state, right? It's very easy to, I mean, to be honest, all four of us are, and you started the conversation with this, Samir, all four of us are highly privileged in terms of where we are
Right.
sitting and having this conversation. And, as they always say, where you stand depends totally on where you sit. And,
Correct.
it's even from this position of privilege, I think what you're talking is absolutely spot on, that it's all very well to say, cut A, B, C, D, it'll work. But when it comes down, to going from A to B, it becomes a very difficult emotional shift to make mentally and physically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right.
And the
Uh,
temperament thing was I found very interesting because you said two,
Mm.
three things. One was you had the confidence. Of course, you have a little bit of assurance that yes, I have a house and all of those. But I had the confidence. And you also said I could easily leave a bank camp, which kind of comes to identity. And we will talk about purpose and identity. Sometimes
yeah,
it's more difficult to leave a big name because if you're drawing all your identity from that brand that you have, it becomes all the more difficult to kind of step out and just be by yourself. But we'll come to purpose. Maybe we'll dig a little deeper into the financial preparation because I think that's very important in terms of
just
taking.
one small input I'd like to now that this has come up, a little bit of
Mhm.
history about might
Mhm.
be relevant. So I actually, after my 12th standard, I actually went to an engineering college for a while. Okay, I was doing computer engineering back in 1990, and I thought that this is not what I want to do. So I came back home and said I want to quit, and I just want to do pure science.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the point was perhaps I had the confidence that I'll be able to, I knew that,
Mm.
in terms of quantitative subjects, etc., I could manage, and if not this, I do CA, something or the other. I was again, I don't know whether it was justified, but I was very confident of my abilities in those things. I'm not sure it was justified, and you can imagine coming back to a middle class home of salaried
Yeah.
employees, kind of
Ah.
people. And my father was okay. My father was, by the way, in corporate India, like I said, but he was also professor of finance, and he taught in places like Bajaj and all that. In Bombay, he taught in a lot of
Oh.
colleges. So I was
Yeah.
exposed to finance very early in terms of that. So I was pretty confident. "Ye nahi to engineering ne to I'll do CA," but I didn't like what was being done there. I thought that my interests are more in pure science. I'd rather do a math or stat course, or physics, math, stat course. And if it comes to trying to do, getting work, then I'm sure that CAT ho jayega ya to CA ho jayega, kuch na kuch ho jayega. I was pretty sure of that.
So,
So that
there seems to be, Samir, and you're being, in my opinion, you're being a little humble by saying that, my mental makeup is such, etc. I mean, I think somewhere in that is the resilience that we were talking about and that Sachin alluded to. I mean,
yeah,
where your resilience has come from a very early age, of course, I don't know, but
hard
I
for
mean,
me to hear.
clearly it's there because even as early as your first year of college, you had the resilience to turn around and say, "Yeah, I'll figure it out, but jo ye hai, mere ko ye nahi karna hai, because
Exactly.
this is not doing it for me." Right? And that the resilience to do that is for a I'm assuming 18, 19-year-old at that time would not have
Yeah.
been would not is not normal. Is not normal at all. In
You're right.
the 80s, when
Yeah.
what Sachin was alluding to, right in the middle, you just went from step A to step B to step C in terms of your education. There are very
Yeah.
few people who would have done what you did, I feel.
And
No, you're right.
so
You're
I
right in the
feel,
sense that,
sorry. Well,
yeah, Sachin, you were saying
no,
something. Yeah.
I just feel, I mean, to Shuman's point and the point we were making earlier, I think it's a mixture of temperament and privilege. I
Right.
mean, it's obviously even, I mean, I don't know about in Sameer's case, but, some of my resilience does come from the fact that I know I'll bounce back. I know I have fallback options, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah.
Even when I made the plunge into, starting my journey on my own. So it does come from that, but some of it does come from temperament. And I think
Hmm.
to Shaman's point, which he was just mentioning, it does come from identity and what you see as your own sort of deep sense of purpose and what you see as truth for yourself. I mean, maybe for Sameer, staying in that engineering course, he wasn't being true to himself, and he just had
That's
to
true.
get out of there to be true to himself, which is, and of course, maybe some amount of privilege allowed him to do that without worrying too much about, where the next meal was coming from or
Exactly.
whether, whether
Yeah.
wasting a year in an
Yeah.
engineering college would be terrible or so on. Sorry, Sameer, I interrupted you when you were saying something.
Yeah. So when we talk about my later, forays into entrepreneurship, where does the temperament come from, or where does this kind of? So I was just trying to give an example of, what I did was extremely rare. Actually, I can't think of too many people who did that. All kinds of questions come that even if you were to get into an interview situation, how will you explain the hiatus
Yeah.
and so on? I
Yeah.
said, I'll be able to do it. Don't worry. I'm sure. Again, it was it was my first attempt, and I did well in the interview. I remember my interview pretty well, actually, the interview and the GD. Uh, but there was this confidence that I'll be able to do it. Uh, yeah, it went well finally.
So one thing that's emerging clearly is while confidence is important, probably what is even more important is resilience. We have talked about it in the
Yeah,
past. Definitely, once you start doing something on your own, your resilience grows because there's too much uncertainty and all of that.
yeah,
But even to make that change, I think you need to start with the resilience. This entire mindset of um, shoot first, then aim, right? As opposed to aim and then shoot, and you're forever aiming because you're not shooting,
correct.
right? So that's fascinating. I think, yeah. So that temperament, we can call it temperament, we can call it mindset, and that's also what probably builds the confidence. isn't it?
Something, and I'm kind of moving on here. Something that Suman and I have talked a lot about, and we've spoken to each of you also, is that I think one of the key factors while taking the leap or the plunge or whatever, is the financial part of it, right? Whether it's in terms of the salary hitting on the 31st, or it's a matter of making sure that if I don't do this for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, what's it going to have an impact on me? Um, and of course, all of us know this is true for anyone I mean, definitely similar upbringings for us in the 70s and the 80s, that resources and money was a very, very important element of our careers, and of our studies to begin with. I think all of us were studying and working to improve our lot in life. That was a very important part of who we were and where we were going. So when you were making this decision to get off the beaten track of the corporate career, etc., how did you go about thinking about financial planning? How did you kind of go about doing the calculations? Did those thoughts come first, or did the feeling that you want to get out or get off the beaten track come first? Did they come together? How was that thought process? Samir, maybe you can talk us through that a little bit to begin with.
Yeah, you kind of do it concurrently, right?
For us,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
all
So, like I mentioned, the idea started, forming in our minds in 2007, and we started off on trying to raise some amount of capital, right, from uh, family, friends, etc. And so, from 2007, it was incorporated in 2008, but I joined only in 2009. So, so in our case, we had a reasonable amount of money to start with, to give ourselves salaries, modest salaries, of course, very modest, uh, but still okay. In the sense it was enough, more than enough to pay my bills at least for now. So in the specific context of Gram Oorja, we planned it that way. We raised some capital, and we had enough money for paying ourselves for 2 to 3 years at least. So apart from that, personally, also there were investments and so on, which one had made earlier, etc., which kind of also gave me some comfort of being able to carry myself through any rough patch here. So there wasn't that much of a worry. I think what helps is also, I mean, my lifestyle is genuinely quite modest, in the sense that I'm still comfortable. Again, having grown up in Bombay in the 70s and 80s, taking a local train for me is not a problem at all. I of course, don't live in areas from where local train travel is difficult. Like I live in Bandra Khar, from where Churchgate is really not a problem. So to give an illustration, so that kind of completely changes how much money you require. I mean, that being an illustration example of things which I'm comfortable doing, which kind of helped me make the decision. And we raised money, and only then did I full time join in any case. So there was some clarity for at least 2 to 3 years about salaries, etc. And the investments. So it was not, it wasn't, so it was very clear for me that I didn't want to put in a lot of my own capital into this. The way I looked at it is that the difference between market salaries and what I was going to get from Gram Oorja is my contribution essentially to Gram Oorja. You know, uh, because if I also put in all my capital, then I might get into a problematic situation a couple of years later if things take longer to work out. So I wanted that comfort of having my money, kind of. I did put in a small amount, but it was not as if too much was invested from my own capital.
But in
So
terms
that
of,
kind of.
sorry, Samir, to interrupt you, but there, in terms of, and I don't know whether you thought like this or not, but there is a general tendency to think in terms of, I'm going to live 50 years more or 60 years more, and I'm going to need X amount of money between this age and this age and this age and this age and so on. And I mean, everyone in one way has an Excel sheet,
Yeah.
like all good MBAs do. and you kind of go about the thought process using those tools. So how did that work for you? Is that something you worked on,
Yes.
or?
Yes. So again, just to go back here, so we are saying that we had raised money. There was some money coming in from the company itself, and that was definitely going to last for at least a couple of years. And we are saying that by then, the 2.5, 3 years, probably the company will be able to support better salaries, etc. And if not, then again we go back to that old story, right? I'll find something else to do at that time, right? It's not as if this is the last thing. I mean, if this doesn't work, we'll find something else. Yes, there might be some compromise or some amount of cut you have to take, but I don't think it was going to be so low that I wouldn't be able to manage my own finances.
Fair.
Like I
Yeah.
said, partly it's helped by the fact that I'm generally not a major spender, honestly. I've had cars for 10 years, for instance.
But there
I mean,
are
if it works
opportunity
well, why should I
costs,
change?
right? There's opportunity
No, no,
cost. I mean, again, that's one is the cash flow question, and the other is the opportunity cost question, which is something you did allude to, that you saw that as your investment in
correct,
this endeavor that you wanted to do,
correct,
which
correct.
was connecting with your purpose, your meaningfulness, or whatever.
So the other thing, kind of jumping into what can you do to prepare yourself for entrepreneurship. If you start computing opportunity cost too early in your entrepreneurial journey, again you'll find it very difficult as people of our fraternity, especially because it's way too high. It's in the current .com to fintech startups, it might be a little different. I mean, things are working out very well for people. But if you're talking of from the period between 2008 to say 2018-19, I think no successful MBA would have ever been able to start up everything if he actually computed his own opportunity cost and put a
Absolutely.
probability to his success and figured out which. There's
Absolutely.
simply no way any
It
of us
never
would have
made
done
sense.
it. So
It would have never made sense. Yeah.
correct. It would have never made sense because it's probabilistically so low that you'll
Yeah.
reach. So therefore that part you need to be a little careful. Like I said, I'm not qualified in the current, the recent fintech. I think things have changed a lot in terms of the kind of valuations people are getting and stuff like that. So I'm not very familiar with this era of people starting up from colleges like ours, from IITs and stuff like that.
But the
for anything,
probabilistic element is still very much there. Not everybody
No, I'm
is
sure.
successful, right? And obviously
I'm
we all see
sure.
the successes on the magazine covers. So that's a discussion for another day. Please
Yeah,
go ahead. You were saying something.
I'm sure the probabilities are not different, but the pie, the what seems to be the pie has grown in size exponentially for a lot of people. So when you multiply the probability by that pie, for a lot of people it might start making sense. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not very sure. I've not kept myself in touch with all of this entrepreneurship that happens straight out of IIT. You're trying to start some SaaS company, or I don't even understand those terms, so I don't know enough about that. But Mm, but for our time, that opportunity cost was dangerous to get into if you wanted to be an entrepreneur very early on.
Yeah.
It wasn't happening. I mean, Levers, Bank of America, Coca-Cola, in your case, Cadbury's, I think. What? I mean, there's no way. There's no way if you had just stayed on, you would have done very well, right? There's no way you would have made the decision.
Yeah.
So
Sachin,
I
you have
suppose.
any thoughts? Sorry, go ahead, Shuma.
No, I was just thinking. On one hand, we are saying financial preparation is very important, right? Analysis has to be done. At the same time, I think what I'm hearing is if you overthink it, you can get into an analysis paralysis. I think it's very important advice for people who are probably a fence sitter, wants to do something. How much analysis is the right analysis? Okay,
So
if you're
can I
saying
break that down?
table, you're not going to actually do it. So how much do you think is the right amount? And what are the basic things that you need to tick off to make that jump?
Yeah, so I'll address that question. So I think that again two different parts. One is that you obviously don't want to be in a situation where you're really struggling financially for your family and for yourself over the next 10-15 years, right? So you need to do that computation, I think, when you're in your late 30s and you have a family, children, etc. I think so that analysis needs to be done in terms of what is the likelihood, how much money do you have, what are the kind of salaries you can reasonably expect from this venture, what is the likely delays that can happen in terms of when the company becomes financial. That I think you need to do. my point is about the opportunity cost angle. So this is one is you're taking care of your basics very well. Make sure you do the numbers there well. But if you want to keep thinking about, can I make 50 crores from this venture 10 years from now versus I have a 1 crore salary now, and that 50 crores comes with the probability of whatever, like 10% or whatever, 8%, something. And then, but I have an 80 lakh salary, will I be richer? And you keep doing that too much. I think that might be counterproductive. Right? So you must do your basic, you make sure that you are, you're financially also resilient, right? For some time. But the computation on इसमें मेरे लिए क्या है, if you were to put it in that kind of thing, does it make sense from that perspective? Am I going to be richer by doing this or not? I think that you have to at some point of time just jump in, at some point once you've taken care of the first part that I mentioned. I think that's where probably there's a fine. I mean, that's where I would kind of stop. Once you're sure, then just get in.
It's a lot depending on whether you're doing it in your 30s, like Sachin, Sameer, you did, versus somebody who's in his late 40s or maybe early 50s, wants to do something. There's a whole bunch of people like that, right? So equations are very different. Their requirements are very different.
Correct.
There are kids to pay. There are children who are going off to college in a few years. Sachin, any thoughts from you on this particular point?
Yeah, actually 2 or 3. So one of them is, I think, at an overall helicopter view level, passion has to be balanced with practicality. So this thing about chase your passion at all costs, and you will be Steve Jobs and all of that. It will happen to one Steve Jobs, but it won't happen to 9,999 other people. So I think that balance between passion and practicality is important, and we shouldn't understate or underestimate it. The second, which was a personal realization, was I found my lifestyle expenses flattening out in my early 40s. So I was happy staying in the same hotels that I stayed in when I went on holiday. I didn't need to go to like a Four Seasons or a something like that. I was happy flying the same airlines, all of that. So I found that month after month, or year after year, it's not like my expenses are just going up, and therefore that treadmill of wanting to earn, more money to match the increase in expenses wasn't something that I saw. The one point, additionally, or maybe a little contradictory almost, is I still have like a cutoff. Like if I run my enterprise and my personal wealth because of running that enterprise starts reaching a certain limit, then it's time to pull the plug in one form or the other, which could be bring in more money or reduce expenses or whatever. But I do have that cutoff, and it's a very hard sort of number. And if I see, my personal wealth, which is kind of intrinsically linked in with the company's wealth in some way, because mine is a limited liability partnership, I'm like, you got to stop, and you got to think whether your passion is. One related to that was something somebody told me when I moved to the social sector, which is kind of a little spin on what we've been talking about. They were like, where do you get your jollies from? If you get your jollies from flying business class, staying at the St. Regis, this, that, and the other, then maybe, and that's perfectly fine. There is no value judgment or moral judgment on staying at the Four Seasons and not giving X money to charities, a bad thing. Then you need to be practical about managing your life, your career, your working with X, Y, or Z hedge fund like that, and that's perfectly all right. But with that experience in Bihar, with what I wanted to do in life, felt that I wasn't getting my jollies from flying business class, and I wasn't getting, therefore, my jollies from just continuing in private equity for another 5 years. And it's that balance in a weird way of returns. Like when we talk about shareholder returns versus stakeholder returns, in my own brain, there was a shareholder and there were other stakeholders. And I was like, am I maximizing my return for the stakeholders or just for this financial shareholder by continuing in private equity. And so that was important. And one or two practical things, like getting private health insurance when you are young. Very, very important. Because all through my career, I depended on Hindustan Lever or, McKinsey or my private equity fund. And then suddenly you find, like in your early 40s, you're trying to get private health insurance and you're paying like a huge premium because, you've got all sorts of risk factors and all going on. So those sort of practical things, having a cutoff is, I think, important for everybody. But finally, it's like, where do you get your jollies from? If you get your jollies only from your bigger car, 50 crore house, driving the latest sort of, Mercedes or whatever, then you have correctly set up your life, maybe, for just making more and more money with a higher probability than, to Sameer's point, what can happen by, following a passion or setting up an enterprise.
Yeah.
Right. But at the same time,
the point you made, sorry, Suman, I'm just going to jump in for one of the points that Sachin made, that, what I really liked, what you were saying about the fact that the financial planning piece doesn't just end when you start. There needs to be some kind of, a level below which it drops, which is a very, very important thing, because a lot of people, when they take the plunge, don't realize that probably. That it's an ongoing thing, and as long as you have that financial calculation already made, it also helps you not to feel claustrophobic or choking when things are not going too well, which they often don't, especially at the beginning of an enterprise or when you take the plunge. Then you have something almost black and white to fall back on, that I'm okay because I've done the calculation, so I'm okay until it goes to this level. So that is a very important element that you bring into the conversation.
Also, just to carry that thought forward, it also comes back to resilience and grit. Because, how do you deal with setbacks? How do you deal with, God forbid, failure? All of that kind of links back to what is important to you in life. Who are the stakeholders in your mind or outside your mind you're dealing with? And for you, like, how is the spectrum of what you want to get out of the rest of your life? What is that spectrum? If that spectrum is, like we were saying, very financially driven, then you will be taking more financially beneficial decisions. And maybe following a passion or an entrepreneurship venture might not be what the doctor ordered. But if you are okay dealing with failure, if you're okay, picking yourself up if there are setbacks, then you might just be, more willing to sort of take that plunge. And this is a broader point, Suman, Atul, and Sameer. I don't think following the passion or entrepreneurship is for everybody. So, it's not कि सबको करना चाहिए और अगर आपने नहीं किया तो you're missing out on something big in life. I think that for some people, it's just great to stay where you are, to, get that 31st check, keep getting increments and promotions, and all of that.
I think there's also this bias, right? When I'm leaving behind something, I'm looking at that is the upside. But when I'm thinking ahead, I'm thinking of the worst situation, isn't it? So I just triggered a thought because you were talking of houses and cars. So there are entrepreneurs today who live in a much bigger house and now drive a much better car than what they were doing while they were working, because they would have made 100x and not expected that to happen. When you're on your own, it's never linear. There is an inflection point. At one point, it can get very big as well. Right? So are we factoring that in is the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think it absolutely makes sense. And I think, Suman, not to knock you, but sometimes I think what is your definition of big?
True.
Is it 50 to 100 crores in valuation, or is it the number of people that Gram Oorja has brought, light and electricity to? Is it the number of
Yeah.
entrepreneurs who've been able to bring successful businesses in the work that I do? So what are the parameters?
But that's very
Yeah,
personal, right?
of
That's
course,
very
of
personal.
course. Yeah.
I mean, actually, in some senses, when you decide to do the kind of shift that each of us is talking about, you're actually leaving behind the measurement
Yes.
of a third
Yes.
party, so to speak. So you've got to leave that behind, because if you can't leave that behind, then
Then it's
it doesn't quite
And
make
Atul,
sense.
that is
The
what,
whole
in terms of emotion, makes it hot and messy.
Yeah,
Because the paradigm is shifting. For 30 years of your life, you had
absolutely.
one paradigm of what is big,
Yeah,
what is success, what is this. And then you're shifting the paradigm because you are saying, my passion, I'm following a passion, I'm discovering new things, and the paradigm is new. And sometimes just the shift in paradigm itself can give you the heebie-jeebies
yeah,
and the
yeah,
butterflies and all
yeah,
sorts.
absolutely. And also the thing is that you're still in the physical and environment where you are still exposed to those stimuli,
Yes.
batchmates, friends, social media, forget about everything else, right? All of that is still coming at you at full force. And that's the emotional part that you need to find a way to deal with. And also, dealing with it is not a black and white thing. It's not like you dealt with it, okay, fine, everything is great. It's going to happen. You're going to feel it sometimes, and it's going to mess with your head and your heart. And you're going to have to kind of deal with it. That's the way it
So,
is. I
Atul,
mean,
I have a
there's
question
no
for
there's
you.
no silver bullet to that.
Bec-
Yeah,
no,
yes, go
because
ahead.
I mean, you started your entrepreneurship journey very early, at a time when entrepreneurship was not the thing to do, and you might have given up a placement job or something from your MBA institute at that point in time. So, what was it? Was your paradigm always entrepreneurship, or what was the hot and messy stuff that at that point in time, when being an entrepreneur wasn't such a thing which it is today? Like, how did you do it?
All interesting and some difficult questions. See, Sachin, the thing is, first of all, like you're absolutely right. Entrepreneurship wasn't even a word at that time, right? It was basically you were doing your own business. Entrepreneurship as a word got introduced. Startups got even introduced even later. So, what Sameer was talking about some time back, and I was kind of, it was mentally resonating with me, was that a little bit of it was resilience. It was a mindset. Um, there was no very strong why, and I always tell this story that when I got into studying for an MBA, for me, I always wanted a marketing career, even in college, undergrad, and uh, the ultimate marketing job in the early 90s was Hindustan Lever, right? In India, there was almost nothing better than that. And I did my summer training in HLL as it was then. And I mean, maybe I shouldn't be saying this on a public forum, but in that 8 or 10 weeks of my summer training, at the end of it, I was scratching my head and thinking, is that all it is? You know, what's the big deal? It's cut out to be, catch whiskers and all that. Yeah, it was fun, but it wasn't everything that I wanted in my life, which is when I started thinking that, maybe what I needed was a paradigm shift and not just a linear scale up of a better job, better job, better job.
Yeah.
And a little bit is the resilience of youth. You really don't know what the hell you're doing. Um, Definitely a very healthy dollop of the fact that I had a roof on my head and food on the table, not just food on the table theoretically, literally, because when I came home from work, my mom had food on the table for me, right? I had nothing to worry about at all. I just, it was great. I used to work 16, 17 hours a day. All I came home to do was sleep in my parents' home. So it was very easy in that sense. And one was very lucky, and you just did it. And one was further lucky that you didn't have to, what we are talking about right now about financial calculations. I didn't do any because I had no expenses. What did I have to financially plan for? I had no wife, I had no children, I had nothing to worry about in the future. I didn't know what an investment was. um, let's just do it and we'll figure it out. It's only later on, when you get a few hard knocks, you start realizing all of these factors and elements and you start factoring it in. And what you talked about, that if it comes below this, I'll have to rethink. And, we're all privileged. We were well educated, so could have gone into jobs. One knew that at some level. So it was, a mix of all of these things in that sense. I didn't even think of it as taking a plunge, to be honest. Okay, the last thing, in fact, I was thinking about this about half an hour back when we were talking, and we were talking about, comparison, taking the plunge. You take a plunge when you're changing from track A to track B. I was never on track A. So, there was no reference point for me that I'm changing tracks, right? I finished my education and I got onto a track. That was my track. So mentally, I never had to make a shift. Your thing of, last point, your thing of the ping of the salary, I have never known it.
No,
So,
but Atul, your lack of plunge, to coin a new phrase, kind of harks back to a point that I was making earlier, which is like not finding your passion, but developing your passion. You're
very
doing
true.
your summer training in Hindustan Lever and finding that that was not the marketing that you wanted to do, helped you narrow down from marketing is my passion to, and we mustn't play this to anybody at HUL, that HUL type of marketing is not my passion. And I'm going to
Building my
stay in
own brand.
marketing with
Building
something
my
else.
own brand became my passion. Right? So I didn't want to just build other people's brands, because I wanted to build my own brand. So that shift is what possibly happened at that point. Again, I'm joining the dots, looking back rather than at that point.
No,
It's
I think you
interesting.
bring a point that you had no other reference frame to compare it with. Because half the time
Yeah.
we are comparing as to what am I leaving behind and then what am I getting into, isn't it? So that's very interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's true.
So let's talk a little bit about the passion. I think we've already touched quite a bit about it. So Sameer, I'll just come to you. I just want to pick up that one point that Sachin you mentioned. Initially, you said, you saw some trends, you kind of knew what to do. And even though you didn't use the word passion, you said it was about giving back. There was something about giving back to society, which to me is like purpose. It's passion, right? At the same time, you talked of, how growing up, we were all on the treadmill. So there was a lack of awareness. You just went with whatever, everybody was doing. So somewhere that change would have happened, right? Some awareness got built. You want to talk a little bit about that? So were you already clear? From when did you start thinking about these things? And how long did it take you from the time awareness got built to actually doing something different?
You're talking about the impact oriented business kind of thought process. Is that what you're talking of now? Because there are two parts to my kind of story, right? In the sense, I had taken the plunge earlier too, in terms of during the .com era, right? So that wasn't particularly driven by a sense of wanting to give back or anything of that sort, right? It was just wanting to do something on one's own at that time, as in business. So did that for a couple of years and then came back to industry and then worked in the financial sector and banking software and so on. So I think when I interacted a lot with my co-founder Anshuman, so he also had he used to do a lot of pro bono stuff in villages and so on. We used to talk about the kind of problems that people are facing, etc., and that there is a lot of work to be done. And the idea got into us that this probably the part of, and we are all obviously just being a very small part of the solution, microscopic part of the solution. Actually, we had that recognition, but we believe that the solution would come not from an NGO kind of structure, but from a for-profit kind of structure. So there was this idea that we wanted to do something on our own. There are these problems, and yes, perhaps we could do quite well financially running a business in this kind of stuff, right? So there was this desire to give back, impact, and all of that. But we always wanted to do it under a corporate, as a for-profit kind of mode, right? Yeah. Because in the initial part, a lot of people used to ask us, "Are you running an NGO?" or stuff like that, because So I used to tell that the intention is to run a for-profit, yeah, but it'll take some time for us to reach there, right? So the desire is to be a for-profit company. I think it's partly influenced by my interaction that there is a lot of stuff that needs to be done here. All of us, batchmates or people, our peers, etc., are still focused on solving Bombay's problems or India's problems, and all of that. But there is potentially this huge market. You will be giving back. So what I'm trying to say is it's a bunch of things all coming together, right? It's not that the predominant desire is not necessarily only wanting to give back. I mean, it is there also, right? But you want to do a startup, you want to do a for-profit, all of that comes together somewhere. It's not that I've given up everything else and now I want to just improve the electricity situation in rural India. It's not only giving back. It's kind of a bouquet of various things that come together there. So one felt that there's an opportunity to build a reasonable for-profit in this space where you could also be giving back. So that kind of appealed.
So what's your purpose? I mean, today, if you want, you can stop working also. So what makes you get up from bed and go to work to Gram Oorja? What is the
No. So at this point in time, and this is a question that I ask myself, sometimes. So because now we are 16, 17 years old, and it runs on autopilot. In the sense, Anshuman and I are important for the company in terms of being able to get funding from a Tata Capital or a ICICI Bank or a Bank of America. The rest of the team that we built are excellent in running a company which is focused on delivering in rural India, delivering energy. It's a wonderful team. They can work in all kinds of extremely difficult terrain. But the one weakness that they'll have is if we were to move out. And in fact, just yesterday I had this conversation with Anshuman. So what should we be doing? So the problem at this point of time is that this perhaps might just all collapse if we just move away right now. There isn't that ability to kind of get funding, continuous funding. That is probably the weakness at this point of time. I think that having got it here, the motivation is obviously to keep it running for as long as possible, right? Even in our absence, as in there is a desire that your baby should last much longer than you do, right? So in that sense, so that is our current motivation, I think. So if, for instance, if someone comes along and is able to do this, then we might actually step back.
Interesting.
Slightly.
Great.
For both Anshuman and me, it's very clear. I've had conversations with him on this. So perhaps 3-4 years down the line, we might just step back.
Okay. Sounds good. Sachin, you want to come in here?
I mean, my organization is a lot younger than Sameer's. But my motivation is, I mean, in a weird way, the problem that my work tackles is a big one because I define impact quite broadly. Bottom of the pyramid impact, and even as the bottom of the pyramid in India, for slowly kind of climbs up the ladder, there will be tons of issues for them. So the problem is really huge. But sort of something, what has become my passion or has become an important part of my passion over the last, I think, 3 to 4 or maybe 4 to 5 years is to see how technology can accelerate the delivery of impact. And it came up in the weirdest way. So, when I used to work a long time ago, one of the people who's a funder of, who I know quite well is a guy called Mike Novogratz, who used to run a very, very large hedge fund based out of New York. And he was a big believer in Bitcoin. And he gave my organization some money in Bitcoin. And from a risk perspective, we sold that Bitcoin in like 30 days because, from a risk perspective, with the prices jumping around, we couldn't hang on to Bitcoin. And when he realized that we had sold his Bitcoin, he was most upset. And he was like, what have you done? This would be, and of course, it was worth like 10 times as much 6 months later. And then it fell back to zero or something like that. another 6 months later, which was exactly the risk that we were trying to avoid. But I got a little bit of an understanding of blockchain technology from that. And I suddenly realized how transformative blockchain could be for money transfers. If there was low-income consumer wanting to transfer money from Kurnool to Kadapa, then actually, going to the bank and all of that. And of course, our UPI system in India, which works very well, is built to an extent using blockchain. And now my passion is more like how are emerging technologies going to accelerate that. And the startups that I work with are people who are leveraging technology to deliver impact. So I'm not interested in deep tech and whether you're writing the next beautiful program and all of that. I'm just interested in how your technological solution can accelerate impact. So in a weird way, it's not that I've reinvented my company or my passion, but I just think I have found a new angle, which is exciting, which keeps me on my toes, which forces me to learn new things and read and maybe take a Coursera course. Most importantly, talk to a whole bunch of entrepreneurs who are doing work in that area, and that's what prevents it from just becoming like, okay, I'm going to create a funding pitch and then show it to like 3 venture capital funds, and then we'll see whether a transaction happens or not. And I do think that one. I mean, it works in all directions. I think some people, would continue to have a very, very steady passion, which would continue for years and years and years. Maybe some people need to reinvent, parts of that passion and get excited by different things. To hark back a little bit to Atul, maybe in the marketing arena, you could find, different aspects which kind of excite you, and you could follow them. So that's what truly I think, Suman, sort of keeps me close to my passion. It's very much the same passion. The end result, the impact that I'm trying to drive is the same. The means of driving that end result have become a little bit more specific in technology oriented.
Got it.
Sachin, you've touched upon a very interesting point, and while it's not related to purpose directly, but I'll just kind of underline what you just said, which is when you almost own your own time, or own your own day, or own your own, I guess it's about time. There is so much more you can do in terms of discovery, in terms of reading, in terms of going down rabbit holes, in terms of, like, for example, you said, you realize about this technology being important to you because of a random occurrence that happened with you. And to me, this is probably the single biggest payoff from making the leap or taking the plunge, right? Because you can, even though, when all of us who've been, in some way running enterprises realize that you still have a boss, which is the client, right? So it's
Right.
not like, it's not everyone says you're your own boss. My God, life is lovely. It doesn't work like that. There is a customer, there is a client, and that person is in some way your boss. So you're answerable in life. You're always answerable to someone. But having said that, you own so much more of your time and your mind space that you can discover so much more. I feel, even though I've never had a job like we were talking earlier, but I think that's a real great payoff from doing this.
And just to add
Agreed.
a little bit of, just a little bit more, because Atul, that is so well said. In my organization, from the time I set it up, I have not allowed in a hierarchical sort of sense, but I've encouraged people who work in the team to also have 15% of fallow time. That you do what you want. You want to go into the gaming
Beautiful.
universe and figure out, how to win in PUBG. You go do that. And I think some young people even struggle with making use of that time. They're like, no, please tell me what I need to do and what you want as a deliverable.
That's true.
But some people take
Yeah.
to it as like fish to water. And Atul, truthfully, with some people, there's a beautiful transition where first they don't know what the hell this guy is talking about. And then 3 months later, they're like, like I came across this and this happened. And I was just going on a holiday to Kerala. And then I found this guy doing this somewhere. And I spent a day with him and beautiful things happen. So I think you are absolutely right. That fallow period when you're not just focused on what do I have to deliver tomorrow to the client and often allows your mind to kind of float off in different directions, which can be very valuable over the long term and very enriching because I think it makes for a better experience for people also, rather than
So true.
just like, oh my god, I have to push out this client deliverable by 6 o'clock today, and how do I get that done?
But I think there's one more angle, and I thought that was very interesting. Time to read, time to study, all that is fine, and you are anyway bombarded with information. But the ability to convert information into insight, that aha moment, that's when the
Yes.
penny drops, right? A lot of people may be hearing about blockchain, but the fact is it hit you like this is going to be a game changer. So everybody's getting the same information, but you are able to convert that into an insight, which you are actually utilizing and making decisions based on that. I think that is also very important.
But Suman, in a weird way, I have found, and this is my personal experience, that initially I was coming from private equity and consulting, so I put down a structure that on the last Wednesday of every month, everybody's going to prepare a presentation for the internal team on what is it that they have discovered from their 15% fallow time that they've done over the last 3 months or 4 months. And then I realized that, like almost creating an end product out of it was almost killing the whole purpose, the whole joy of this fallow time. So later on, I made it. I like I had told you before, I like structure, so I couldn't get totally rid of it. But I still made it much more just let your mind float, explore these things. If you find something which you think the team would benefit from, come back and talk to us about it. If it is relevant to the kind of work we do, even better. It doesn't always have to be. So one of the guys investigated, and we do a little bit of work in climate, like the carbon footprint of F1 races. Okay, F1 races have a huge, massive carbon footprint. And what is the carbon footprint, and how can technology kind of, help, which was what was relevant to our work. And it was just very exciting for everybody to hear this random presentation of how many truckloads or plane loads come and how much effort it takes besides all the fuel and all that is burnt in the racing itself. And what are even companies like Ferrari, like McLaren and all doing, trying to reduce it and so on and so forth. And how does the F1 race going to Abu Dhabi, how does it affect the effort people are putting in to reduce the carbon footprint of the F1 races? So just interesting stuff.
I think it's interesting that structure which you talked about. We all kind of, at least here in this panel, we all have this affinity for structure. Maybe thanks to our management.
No, and I should correct. I should remove any misconceptions. The other 85% is pretty structured, I think.
It's structured and clearly answerable and must be productive.
Much to the horror.
When you look back, okay, if you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently? And what would you do the same? So maybe start with Sameer and then Sachin.
We realized, for instance, the importance of having a very good tech person a little later, 2-3 years into running the operation. And being in rural India, the importance, inaccessible kind of places, counterintuitively, it's more important to put technology which is really, really robust, because the cost of servicing is extremely high. If you're in Bombay and you buy an inverter which conks out, say, in 6 months, you can always get an electrician.
So I think the three or four things which I think I may have done differently. Definitely wait less. Okay, wait less for the right idea, the right time, the right bank balance, the right this, the right that. Wait less than I did. Since I did.
Okay, so basically,
quicker. Take, if you want to call it the plunge, take it earlier. Don't analysis paralysis is the real thing, and we are all I think we are all trained on analysis. And sometimes when it's something so close to us, it can lead to paralysis. It might not lead to it when you're doing it for the company you're working for, but when it's so close and it's so hot and messy, it can lead to paralysis. So I think that's one. The second thing is, I think for me, this is a personal sort of learning for me, be less shy. When I started off my entrepreneurship journey, I used to be very shy about the journey, about what I was doing, about my idea. Because I used to be like, oh my God, Hindustan Lever has, 50,000 crores of turnover, blah, 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 blah. I'm just a little guy who's starting up with this little idea. And I wouldn't sort of project it. I wouldn't transmit my passion well enough to the person I was speaking to. So I was shy. I was diffident about this journey I was getting onto. And I was like, you don't need to overblow it and say that, I'm going to create Amazon, but be confident, be proud of the fact that you're doing it. Explain your story well to people who are there to listen. So that's the second thing. And then the last thing, in which I didn't do well, was tap into your existing support system. So I was a little bit like, oh, I'm starting this little thing. The ex-partners from McKinsey or the ex-partners from my private equity fund will not be so interested in this. And the truth of the matter, Suman, Atul and Sameer, is when they heard about what I was doing, they were calling up and saying, why haven't you told us that you're doing this? And we'd love to hear about, the stories that you're gaining. We'd love to support, your organization in some ways. If you come across interesting startups, that we're willing to, put in like whatever it is, X amount of money into them. And I was like, I was almost sparing my support system of the sob story and the little thing that I was doing. While actually, I think the support system was actually proud of the fact that somebody was doing this. And
that is such an amazing insight. That's such an amazing insight. Yeah.
Me to confidently tell my story and to reach out to people in my support system and tell it to them to start with, which rather than put a cloak over it and saying that, oh, I'm doing this. So I think those are the three things I think I would really change. There are others, of course, in terms of team building and so on and so forth, but
super. Sameer, sorry, we lost you in the middle.
Yeah. I think there was a bit of a problem with the net. So in terms of,
you were talking about that particular thing of,
Right. So in the sense, the early days, we were probably not as particular about the kind of technologies that we were using as we later became, because we realized that in the remote areas, it's more important to have extremely robust solutions, because the cost of servicing far outweighs the initial capital cost, right? That's point number one. Point number two is, whenever we sold to any company, we made sure that quality of revenues, we don't want accounts receivables in our books at all. We don't want that problem at all. Everything comes in advance or to the extent possible. Therefore, no government projects at all. We've never done. So we are very happy about that. No loans, zero loans, negative working capital, no government financing. All of these things are decisions that we made company-wise, specific decisions, and we are very proud of. And I'm sure that we would not have survived if we had gone in some other direction.
You make an interesting point, Sameer, about values there. I think that is something we haven't talked much about, but I think that's an area that, because values become so important to impact on business. And clearly you've made that decision, and values also have a logical perspective to it in this case, because you're not thinking of it as 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. You're thinking long term. And that's crucial.
Because it's so tempting to take that 20 crore order from a government. No?
Yeah.
It's very difficult to say no to it.
Maybe we'll just go to the last question. So I'll go to Sachin. So what advice would you give to someone who's
sitting on the fence?
Of doing something.
Don't do it. No, kidding.
Yeah. But what I got out of that was keep a good sense of humor, because that is crucial to this journey for sure.
No, I think this is going to be repetitive. Obviously, there's a lot of advice one can give. But I think in terms of passion, develop, don't find. It's not going to drop out of the sky one day. Look back at your experiences, look back at what you enjoy, look back at when you felt the most energized, the most, when blood was coursing through, adrenaline was pumping. Somewhere over there, there is a passion. Develop it, think about it. Don't try to find something shiny, new, a silver bullet, which will just appear somewhere. And then the second one is, again, we've discussed this, prepare, but don't overthink. Prepare, be practical, and, have your, maybe some hard stops, maybe some soft stops. What are the non-negotiables? To Atul's recent point, what are the kind of values, that you want to inculcate in the business or in the organization? But don't overthink it. I mean, you can have serious analysis paralysis, which is not going to help you, and it's definitely not going to help the consumer or the end receiver, which you were doing, because obviously you will be frustrated after a point कि इतना analysis कर लिया पर निकला तो उससे कुछ नहीं, and obviously there is no product or service being delivered to anybody which they will appreciate. So prepare, be practical, but don't overthink it. And if you think you're heading towards analysis paralysis, you are well and truly into it. Stop and do something.
Atul, did you want to comment anything on what Sachin said? Or
No, I'm good.
Sameer, over to you.
Yeah. So, firstly, of course, what Sachin mentioned about prepare but don't overthink. That's, I think, the motto for all of us. That's extremely important. And then the other thing that I'd like to kind of mention is, of course, you should have a kind of hard stop, where you want to stop, but don't make it very, in the sense, don't. I think people underestimate the time these kinds of things take. So if you're going in with a hard stop of 6 months, etc., I think you better not do it, rather than wasting those 6 months. Also, it's not happening. Most of these things take much longer. You should be prepared for years at least. If you're not willing to do that, if it happens earlier, great, But if you're not, if you in your mind are saying that I want to give this a shot for 6 months, let's see how it works. If not, I want to shut it. Then it's best not to do it in most cases. I think it will not.
I'd agree with that.
Rarely ever actually.
I would agree with that. It's a long haul.
I thought it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking time, sharing your views. So much insights we got, and I'm sure this will be helpful for a lot of people who either done something, who already thinking of doing something different, or maybe in that journey. Atul, would you like to add anything before we close?
I would just like to thank both of them for their time, and we definitely owe them a couple of beers next time we see them, and we shall. Maybe the conversation will be even better at that point. Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you so much.
Is
Have a good
the
evening
uploading
and
and all
weekend.
done? We're good to go.